Hello, hello, all you lovely people. Professor Gray here with your latest module for unit number 6 of the course. We're looking at morality beyond universal rules and principles. And now this unit, as we've seen, is continuing on with our discussion of normative ethics. And as always, we can recall what normative ethics is. Normative ethics is having us state and defend our basic moral principles. And the basic moral principles in this course, if we have seen, have been mainly divided across two different types of approaches. One hand, there are teleological approaches of ethical egoism and consequentialism. And meanwhile, there are those deontological approaches, which range from moderate to absolute. And then, this division between these theories of deontology and teleology concerns the goodness of outcomes. For recall, once again, teleology says that the goodness of outcomes is the only thing with intrinsic moral value. Meanwhile, we have good old deontology that says that there are other things with intrinsic moral value besides the goodness of outcomes. And so, that's where we've been looking. And then, whereas now this unit is starting to move away from that. And so last time we talked about the ethics of care. And you might recall that had 3 parts to the ethics of care, right? It said that morality should emphasize 1, maintaining personal relationships, 2, kindness and beneficence, and 3, sensitivity to one's own needs and the special needs of others. And now we might, if we pull up that chart again with these different, teleology, deontology, we might ask ourselves, well, where does ethics of care go in that picture? Now, I think most people would think that ethics of care is a teleology. That is, you're caring about the goodness of outcomes for yourself and for those with whom you have a relationship. But you can notice there, it's probably not ethical egoism, since you are caring about people besides yourself. And it's not consequentialism, since you're not, having to care about everyone. And so in any case, I think that's where ethics of care would probably go, as some kind of teleology concerned with the goodness of outcomes. Though I will say, perhaps, because there is so much importance placed on the relationships themselves, this might make relationships something different from the mere goodness of outcomes. And so maybe, ethics of care is actually a deontology where relationships have some kind of inherent moral value that's, separate or different from the goodness of outcomes. And so maybe the value of relationships could actually create constraints on actions. So again, maybe ethics of care might have some deontology where there are constraints, like you can't harm, a person you have a relationship with, even if harming them would promote some kind of greater goodness of outcomes. Maybe deontology and relationships place constraints on things. So anyway, it's just kind of illustrating that ethics of care is kind of a interesting thing. And maybe it's a teleology, maybe it's a deontology. At least now you can hopefully think about what that would mean and how you might think about it. In any case, unit number 6 here that we're in is, as I said, is morality beyond universal rules and principles. And the ethics of care is a great illustration of that just general dissatisfaction with rules like the principle of utility or things like the formula of universal law and so on. All these principles that are very universal, broad, that we've seen. Ethics of care seems to suggest that we need to act with sensitivity to the particulars of situations, because every relationship you have is different because there's different people involved. And so that's very sensitive to these contexts and specificity, because relationships are special in that way. And so there doesn't seem to be any general rules or principles that could, be deduced, I guess, that cover all sorts of relationships. It just, it's not like chemistry or physics, right, where we can have absolute generalizable rules that apply everywhere at all times. Ethics seems to be more special and more different. And that's what ethics of care is picking up on, these particular relationships that seem to have a special character that doesn't just generalize to a principle of utility or a formula of universal law. And indeed, we can actually see a similar idea in Aristotle. If you open up the text there, just jump to page 2. Right at the top of page 2 there, we see Aristotle says that precision must not be sought to the same degree in all accounts of things. for lack of regularity is found also in good things, because of the fact that they turn out to be a source of damage to many people. Some, in fact, have perished because of wealth, others because of courage. Now, just before we go on there, I might want to pause and just note, this starts to sound a little bit like Immanuel Kant, right? Because we recall Kant opens up by talking about conditional goods, goods that have limitations. Because remember, Kant says most things will turn out bad if they're not also in the presence of a good will. And so here Aristotle is noting a similar problem, that is, good things that we all think are good, like wealth or courage, could turn into bad. And so, hey, that's kind of interesting that Aristotle might be agreeing with Immanuel Kant, that something else is needed. But of course, Aristotle is different. Aristotle is not Immanuel Kant. Aristotle is going to say that some kind of good character is what's needed. Whereas, Kant says no, but that's you can go back and review Kant. Kant's very specific, right? But Aristotle's no. He says good character is what can make things like this good. So anyway, if we go back to page 9 there, where I was just reading from, we jump back there, Aristotle does continue that we must be content then when talking about things of this sort to show that what is true about them roughly and in outline. For it is the mark of an educated person to look for precision in each kind of inquiry, just to the extent that the nature of the subject allows it. And so now, to kind of go back to the more general point that Aristotle is making in this, is that he is not going to provide universal rules and principles when it comes to ethics and morality. Aristotle is going back to that core idea we saw way back at the beginning of this course. We saw this right in the first unit, right, where Socrates had this idea that ethics was important because it was talking about how we ought to live. And so, Aristotle thinks ethics is about a human life and the human experience. That's what Aristotle wants to go really back to that, take that seriously. And then look, you guys know this, human life, human experience is messy and imprecise. And so Aristotle is saying, because life is messy and imprecise, ethics and morality, they're going to be messy and often imprecise as well. And now, of course, Aristotle does believe he can still say a lot about ethics and morality. He wrote a whole book on it, obviously. But Aristotle's going to say what he's going to talk about is never going to be reduced to a single rule like the principle of utility or the formula of universal law. We're never going to see anything like that in Aristotle. Again, Aristotle is much more going to be sensitive to context and specificity in the situations in which you find yourself. So this isn't ethics of care in Aristotle, but it is similar in the sense that relationships and other things will play roles. It's just Aristotle is a much broader theory than just about caring relationships, as we'll see. It's about character in general. And now I'll just note that there is some debate amongst people about whether Aristotle is doing teleology or deontology here. There is some disagreement about that. I figure trying to resolve that is probably far too much for this introductory ethics course, so I won't go into this. But what I will say is that the ethics of Aristotle is often known as an ethics of virtue, though for reasons we'll see shortly, I will call it an ethics of excellence. And so this virtue ethics, this ethics of excellence, is definitely different from ethical egoism as we've seen it. It's definitely different from utilitarianism, and it's definitely different from Immanuel Kant's deontology. There's just very different things. Obviously, that's why we're reading it. Something different is happening here. And so in this module, I do want to introduce you to this Aristotle's ethics of excellence, or Aristotle's virtue ethics. And so to go through this, first I want to discuss what Aristotle means by happiness, which is a discussion about eudaimonia and the flourishing life. Second, we'll consider Aristotle's moral psychology, or soulology, because Aristotle is talking about in this passage, he's talking about the human soul, and the Greek word for soul is psyche or psyche, and that's actually where we get the word psychology from. So it's kind of fun. So psychology is soulology. So we'll talk about that second. Third, we'll see how Aristotle goes about defining excellence of character. Fourth, we'll see how this idea of excellence of character sets up what is now known as the doctrine of the mean. And finally, we'll see Aristotle's account for how we go about acquiring excellence of character. So there it is. Whew, that's our module. Oh, giddy up. But before we just dive into all that, let's take our first break. And then we come back and we'll start talking about Aristotle.